Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming out because this is a topic I've wanted to share for probably ever, and to have you guys as the audience is just absolutely phenomenal. My name is Dave Siederer. I've been active in the Apple world for a little while. Incidentally, this was 1990, and if you're able to see what I'm playing on the screen, no one's been able to name it before. So if you find me and you think you know what it is, that game, then oh, I've got a hand up. Lode Runner's a good guess, but it's not. It's a solid guess because they're very similar.
What's a bad screenshot?
That's true. Terrible screenshot. All right, so to start things off, what is this thing I'm talking about? And UI scripting or GUI scripting or whatever you may call it, cheating, is really just about using the accessibility framework to automate things. So a lot of UI scripts look completely unintelligible, but some of that can kind of come from a very simple application, and we're going to take a look at that. And that last piece right there is very dependent on either incredibly explicit permission from the user or from a management utility. And of course, the why is that there are some, and I'd say a lot of apps that weren't built with an AppleScript dictionary in mind. They were built for just to use the app, and that's about it. Almost every app, with a few exceptions, I think Electron apps have a little bit of trouble, are able to be scripted this way. So there's almost nothing out there that can kind of resist the power, if you will. And yeah, this whole operation is about creating something like an API, something where you're communicating with this app in as background a way as possible. And I always do recommend, as much as I love UI scripting, and I truly do, if there is a way to do that through the command line or through a dictionary, that's usually the way you want to go. A lot of the time, that option's not there. And this is one of my major projects that I've done, which was pure AppleScript, which called First Aid. And it's I got clever with it. It's short for First Apple ID. And one day, somebody came to me at my organization and said, we need 200 Apple IDs. And the ask was, how many interns do I need to hire for this? And I asked them to give me a few hours. So that was 200 the first time. And naturally, the second time around, they wanted 60,000. And this has actually kept going, although DEP and VPP have really made things a little bit more obsolete. When it comes to Apple IDs, there are still edge cases and things like that. So this is actually still running 160,000 Apple IDs in over 40 countries just from this script alone. So what do you do to use this? To create your script, it's a little bit more complicated than just grabbing an editor. You need a UI inspection tool, something to take a look at what each element is on a given page or on a given window, that sort of thing. And patience can be a key because sometimes this does get frustrating. My personal tools of the trade, I'm still using Script Editor. I probably should upgrade to Script Debugger, but I haven't yet. Fiddlesoft has a wonderful app called UI Browser that I'm a big fan of, and that'll let you kind of dig down to the exact elements that you want to get to. I am using a binary from someone on macOS 10 Hints, which has since shuttered or is read-only today. But it was a very simple binary called click, and that is basically for uncooperative situations. Most of the time, if you're doing a UI script and you say click this button, 9 times out of 10 it'll work. That 10th time, it's always the most important button on the page. And yeah, some loud, angry music does help with the patience part of things. Now we'll talk authorization because this is a very important part. Without any authorization, your script basically will do nothing but maybe give a not-so-friendly error message. You can do this manually through system preferences, and there is I actually have a subroutine that kind of grants that as much of a shortcut to the user as possible for that. But it's very explicit, especially in 10.14, about what an app can do and can't do, as we've definitely seen. And of course, there is the way to do this automatically when you push through management, and that is the CCCP. No, the PPCP, CHRP, USB-C, the PPPC, P profile. So the privacy preferences policy control. This is definitely something I'm sure you guys are are either getting familiar with or have to be familiar with. And this allows us to do some really great things. So basically, as long as your app is signed, has an identifier, or you know the path to it, it's possible to give that automatic authorization. Any app that it's interfacing with does need that permission turned on. So without the if the permission is missing from, say, you're scripting iTunes and you're scripting system events, you'll need permission for both of those. I say system events because that's one that we're going to be using a lot here. And a little bit on this PPPC train. Interestingly enough, I have an AppleScript handler that checks to see whether or not it's enabled. Basically, it's enabled to talk to another app. And that fails, interestingly enough. So I've described PPPC more as a trust fall. So it's sort of, you have to believe that it's working, and most of the time it does. Definitely highly recommend too, there is a PPPC profile creator from Jamf, I believe, that they've put out. It's a much easier way to go about a lot of the requirements. The profile is a complex one if you're not using either a template or some sort of utility. So yeah, there's plenty of time for your patience to run out while you're actually scripting. And I mentioned the anything that's interacting, that includes OSA script. So if you're doing this through the command line, you do need to make sure that those permissions are properly on there. So one of my favorite things is to solve a problem, which I think this is the perfect sort of thing to do. How about the dreaded web form? This form has no APIs, no bulk upload options, and no consideration to the person that's on it 20 times a day, which is probably you. So just in basic form, this is sort of how we're going to look at this. We want to step through the process first manually, step through it again. We're going to take a look at what elements are going to be required. We're going to add some checks for that as well, some sort of next step, ready to move on to the next part of our script. And finally, adding some fault tolerance as the bugs come, because they always will. So this right here is Fiddlesoft UI browser. And what I'm doing right here is just drilling down to see what's going on with that text field. So you can, I'm going to start that over just a moment because it goes very fast. Basically, you can keep hitting the right arrow, but you see that highlight in blue. It's actually zeroing in on each of these elements. And from there, it's just a matter of picking from that little AppleScript menu down at the bottom and saying, okay, I want to work with this element. And so we're going to start off with just filling this box with the serial number. And that's fairly simple at this point. So we want Safari to activate, to open up. I tend to do shell script for opening URLs just because it's very dependable. And right now, all we're doing here is setting the value of this incredibly long-looking string. But you saw when we were, luckily these long-looking strings are things that you don't have to memorize. It is something that's generated through something like UI browser. So it's basically, you're basically just using that to say, okay, this is where that element lies. Some apps are going to be much shorter. Safari is almost universally long. There are a lot of layers that really go into a Safari web page. So you saw how simple that form was, and yet it takes us kind of all these little steps to get there. So don't be afraid also to to do a repeat loop. and maybe pull for that element in a couple of different places, because sometimes these you end up with a moving target, something that basically just keeps changing position, or ID. AX attributes are also incredibly useful for this. You can, if you wanted to look into that, take one of those UI elements and do get every attribute of that really long string, and you can find out not only if it has a name, the element itself, but values, a lot of statuses that you can use to make sure that you're in the right spot at the time. And if there's a string on an element that changes each page, that's the best thing in the world, because that basically means you can figure out when your script is falling down, what page you're on, and really get that as you want it. So let's go for some next steps here. We were doing some real hard coding there. You guys now know my serial number too, but I don't think it matters. But we want to find some actions in here too that signify that the wait is over and that your script can actually do something at the time that it needs to. And this looks very complicated because it is a little bit. But this is a subroutine I wrote called check loading, based on actually an open source one, but with a lot more options and a little bit easier to find. With Safari, you want to make sure that a web page is fully loaded before you actually perform any actions to it. Otherwise, you usually end up with missing elements in the wrong place. And this is going to be up on a site at the end. I'll give you guys the URL. But this has been supremely useful to me. So we're actually going to call that within the script here. So right now we've got a few variables set up. There's my serial number, that is my actual email address, and I don't really require a new Mac, but I might as well be the person to do it. And that check loading right after opening the web page means that until that web page is complete, the script isn't going to go anywhere. And we're just basically doing kind of what we did just a moment ago, except with all three elements of this form. So we've got the serial number, we've got the email address, and the message that goes in here. So third up, we want to find another indicator of successful operations and failures too. Always pull for that sort of indication. When you're positive that this means the end of a process, then that's something you can basically set up a repeat loop and maybe give it a tenth of a second delay to make sure you're not overloading the script itself. And I mentioned augmentation here, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but basically a good script sometimes doesn't do everything for you. For example, if a page has a CAPTCHA on it, that's something that I'm sure there's some machine learning out there somewhere, but scripts aren't really doing too much of today. So in those cases, a lot of the time I'll have that wait for me to type in the CAPTCHA code and then come back with that. And so here we've got a little bit more. What we've done basically is right below the first set values, and there's just this little repeat loop I have delaying by half a second, and that variable landing check is basically waiting for a confirmation message. So if unfortunately I cropped out the variables from the top, sorry about that, but there's a variable called myConfirm that will be that basically is the text you would see on a successful run, and if that's contained in this in the spot here, it happens to be a button on this in this case, then stop repeating and go on. And then there is the fourth wave of things. You do want to first things first. I always say do it once, because once is important. If it has to work at least once. And also make sure that you're gathering any other data that you're looking for in this case. So see, it's looking more complicated, but we're just kind of adding these little elements to make this go as smoothly as possible. So this is a single run here, and you've got at the bottom just after end repeat the ticket number to grab from this web page, because once the Once the page is loaded, that's basically what that brings back to you. And there it is. And finally, work is never done, of course. You do want to extract that data after submission. Figure out your format on the output as well. There are sometimes I tend to use CSVs a lot just because they're fairly universal. But I've also run into occasions where there's a ton of commas in things, and that doesn't usually work out. So any separation value you can definitely use for that. And make sure to do a little bit of cleaning on some of this data. So before we saw that return was a ticket number, and then we had the ticket number. That was the whole thing that it was reading. So now we want to make that a little bit different. And let's see here. Yeah, if you can see that try block just under the repeat there, that is grabbing the ticket number and running just an awk on that to give you the thing you want, basically. And we're actually outputting this right now to just to the desktops under a CSV, and that's that echo command just at the bottom there. And I definitely want, this is important. There will be failures. There are expected failures and there are unexpected failures. And the unexpected ones are typically the more damaging. But whatever you can, code around that. If you can get a confirmation of, okay, this is invalid input, this is something that is just not what I'm looking for, any errors, grab strings for that as well. If you're deploying this to users, it's a good idea to explain to them what you're doing, just because it can be a little bit invasive, all of a sudden windows popping up and then closing out. Nobody wants to think that there's somebody watching them, even though they are actually being watched. And this is a big one that actually, honestly, took me a while to really put into my own workflow. But virtualization is incredibly great for if you're doing some sort of a service. So as an example, I have a service where it'll check serial numbers against a database to see if those are in DEP or Apple Business Manager. And that's something that doesn't necessarily need to be interacted with other than having someone send an email to it. So definitely on the important side to do virtualization. And I'm going to mention a few things that seem to have been a little bit buggy, especially in 10.14. There is a set value to an element, and that works sometimes. This is the thing about UI scripting. A lot of the time it's not an exact science. There are a lot of workarounds, things that you don't necessarily expect to need to do. So I mentioned that click binary. There's also another one, CLI click, that's made by an author who actually keeps up with it, if I remember correctly. And you can actually use that basically to almost physically click the actual area you're to be typing in, and then send that through as a string to type out, because you do basically have control over being able to put an actual string of words in just about anywhere. As those new apps ship to new operating system, anything changes, definitely revisit the script, because it very well may break. And if it's not broken, then there may also be an easier way to go about things. So looking at certain apps, they may not have shipped with a dictionary at first, but if some other revision came along that did have that, then it's a good way to go. And from the bottom of my heart, don't give up, because again, this can be frustrating, but it's very much it's a necessary method today, and there's just a lot of apps out there with an absolute ton of ways that they could be interacted with that we're kind of missing out on. I like to keep things fairly short and sweet, and I figured you guys may have some questions, so anyone? Yes, sir.
After the Apple ID creation,
Yes.
both I've used some on scripts years ago.
Yeah.
Mainly yours. For the same reason.
Oh.
What other things have you done on mass? So Apple IDs are one.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. What have I created for this sort of mass deployment? And I made an app called Zero Touch about 8-9 years ago, which was full automation around mainly around iTunes and the iPhone configuration utility. So we were talking a while back. But what that did was, the reason we called it Zero Touch was you could take an iPad, plug it in, and it would fully configure itself, assign an Apple ID to the device. It would download the apps. This is all before VPP. And basically leave you with a device that's personalized for the user, but fully configured. That's one of my big projects. Yes?
You mentioned using UI scripting with Apple Business Manager. How do you deal with the 2FA issue?
That unfortunately has been, that's two-factor authentication seems to be a requirement for Apple on so many of their services at this point that's made it difficult. I have done a little bit in the way of having iMessage open and grabbing that code. So it's 1.5 factor, I guess. But yeah, it is possible to actually grab the code, especially in the newer versions of the OS, where you can actually just tell it to click that little icon that pops up with the code, as long as you're signed into iMessage. Yes, sir.
In my experience, with fewer and fewer apps coming with dictionaries, AppleScript dictionaries built into them, do you see that your reliance on scripting the GUI in general is increasing? And if so, are you worried that it's going to be unsustainable and that Apple will pull support, or they're just going to completely pull the rug from under you?
I've been afraid of that for many years, actually, and that's the sort of thing is. AppleScript is a language that's not super widely known, so it always is a little bit nerve-wracking thinking, is the next version of the OS about to get rid of my big chunk of my livelihood? But I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question again? I apologize.
No,
Yeah, if dictionaries and disappearance of dictionaries. And I think what we're going to see is, I do think dictionaries are just less and less. We have there's so many wonderful developers out there that are taking advantage of publishing dictionaries, but with the rise of Marzipan, which I thought was interesting, UI is a valid way to interact. That was probably the thing I was most nervous about, was seeing some of the news app. As soon as that came out, what I did was ran UI browser over it and did a quick sample script, and everything went exactly the way it should. Thank you. All right. Well, I will say I'll be here all day. They don't let me leave. But if you guys have any questions, definitely feel free to stop by. This is my information. I'm ds@shi.com. You can definitely reach out if anything comes to mind. And I'm going to be putting up some of the source code that we were talking about today on a domain I got lucky enough to buy. It was too cool not to use. Not yet. All right. Well, again, thank you so much. Appreciate it.